Now we're going to talk about related structures of the integument. This is going to include hair and things associated with the hair like the different sebaceous glands and sweat glands of the skin. We're also going to look at features like claws and dew claws and the hoof, so the end covering of the skin over the end of the digits there, and then horns and antlers. So hair ends up in mammals being essential for survival for several different reasons. Right there. It helps to do things like camouflage the body, helps to maintain and keeping an even body temperature, and then protection from the outer environment from things like wet, the sun, and extreme dry conditions. And also differences in temperature from being extremely hot to being extremely cold. Hair is found on mammals. We don't find it on avian or reptiles, so it's just ends up being on mammals. And there is a variation with hair due to the environment. So we find like marine mammals, so something like a whale or a dolphin, they still have hair, but it is much more spread out across the body, so it's not nearly as dense as say on a dog. And then it's actually got special types of hair. A lot more of them end up being tactile hairs, or what we call a wool hair, secondary hair fiber. Whereas if you look at something like a rabbit, they have a very, very dense hair coat, especially those that live in colder climates like the snowshoe rabbit and stuff, where they have a much thicker hair coat. So when we look at the hair, there's a lot of different parts that we'll go over here. So here's a whole list of them to the side. So we're going to start off with looking at the hair shaft. So this is the part of the hair that we see above the skin. The pore is the opening through the epidermis and dermis where the hair shaft actually exits out. What we call as the root is all the part of the hair. So the hair root's all the part of the hair underneath or below the skin level. The root sheath is the part that actually surrounds the hair, and this is actually a growth of the epidermis down into the dermis. We have the hair follicle, which is going to be this whole part of it too, along with the root sheath that ends up going down into the epidermis here, and it's actually going to also contain the sebaceous glands and sweat glands. And then we have the hair bulb, which is the deepest part. So this is the bulb of the hair, and it actually has two parts in it called the matrix and papillae. So the papillae is the part that actually contains the nerve to the hair, and then it's actually got blood flow and a lymphatic vessel. The matrix ends up surrounding the papillae, and this is actually where the hair grows from. So it actually grows down here from the matrix and it pushes up and through. Internal root sheath is the part of the root sheath that is right next to the hair, and the external root sheath is the part that's going to be right next to the dermis. Erector pili muscle is the muscle that's going to attach to the whole hair follicle and actually can control the angle of the hair, and it also can be important too for doing things like causing the pushing out and release of the sebaceous glands there. The sebaceous gland, this is what's actually going to secrete oil into the hair follicle and then up onto the skin. And then we have the apocrine sweat gland, which actually secretes sweat into the pore and then once again out on the skin. So this is all together, all the different parts of the hair, and you can see right here that hair actually, this right here would be the dermis, and down in here would be the actual sub-Q layer. And so when we look at the hair, this is all epithelial cells. So this is actually like an ingrowth of the epidermis down into the dermis with all these structures we see. When we start looking at the hair root sheath, we have three different layers of the root sheath here. We're going to have the internal epithelial layer that's going to be right next to the hair. So if you look, this would be the medulla of the hair. This is the cuticle. This area right here in the pink should be, the cortex is right here in the pink, and this outer red is actually the cuticle, the very outer part of the hair. And then the blue right here is the internal root sheath. So it's right next to the hair. Next we have the external root sheath, which is epithelial, and it's actually the most thickest, and this is actually going to be right next to the dermal layer right here, and then we have our dermal connective tissue. And the main thing that the root sheath does is it gives a way for the hair to actually grow out from the bulb out through the follicle and out onto the past the skin. And having this contact in here with these epithelial cells actually lets this, as it grows, kind of slide out. If you didn't have the root sheath and you just had the connective tissue next to the hair, then the hair would actually never physically grow out. Sometimes we can have damage to the sheath, and sometimes this damage can actually result in ingrown hairs, and so the hair, instead of growing out to the surface, will actually grow down the dermis, and then we can get what we know as epidermal cysts, which are ingrowths of hair and epithelial cells back down into the dermis, and it makes a cyst right there that we end up having removed surgically. When we look at hair follicles, a lot of these are actually compound, and so a simple follicle is just one hair coming through, but most follicles end up being compound, so there are multiple hair strands that are going to grow out of a single pore. They're usually mixed between the two different types of hair, where you'll have a guard hair, which is a primary hair, and then a secondary or wool fiber or satellite hair that's also growing out. It can be as many as 15 hairs growing out of one pore, out of one follicle, compound follicle. When we look at a dog, we actually have 3 compound follicles that will group together, and they'll actually make what's called an epidermal fold, where the skin kind of has this little wrinkle or to the dermis right there, and that little wrinkle or fold, it's actually where you'll have 3 of these compound follicles together. When we actually start looking at hair itself and its way that it's formed, it's going to be epithelial cells. In the very center of a hair, in the middle of the shaft, is going to be the medulla, and this is either going to be just filled with air, there's nothing in there, or it can also have pigment, some melanin in there that will give it color. Next, we have the rigid layer in the middle, which is known as the cortex, and so the cortex is densely packed epithelial cells, and it's packed tight enough to where it gives rigidity to the hair and makes it stand up and makes it have a certain way that it acts in the environment. And then on the outside you have the squamous epithelial cells, which will be the cuticle layer right there, and so they kind of overlay each other kind of in a scale-like fashion right there. And so they actually protect the cortex and the medulla down below. When we look at the growth cycle of hairs, we have 3 main phases. So we have anaphase, which is this is the time of hair growth. So when we look at the anagen phase there, this is where the papilla in the matrix is going to be active. The root sheath is very, very firmly attached to the hair, and it makes it to where the hair is not going to easily come out. Early anagen phase is when there's a new hair growth underneath the hair that's going to be in the telogen phase that we'll get to in a minute. Catagen phase is actually a transitional phase between when the hair is growing and shedding. And so the papilla starts to lose its blood vessels and nerves, and actually hair growth stops. And there's a fairly decent amount of time that hair can be in the catagen phase. It can also be in the telogen phase for a while too. Depending on the hair is how long it'll be in anagen. So a lot of hairs can continue to grow, like the hair on your head can be in anagen for a very long time and continue to grow. Other hairs in the body have a much shorter lifespan, and so they spend a much shorter time in anagen phase. When we get to the telogen phase, this is the club stage of the hair, and it can go into the shedding phase. So in the club phase, the root sheath has much less attachment to it. The papillae has actually lost its blood vessel and its nerve altogether. And so the hair, the end of the bulb ends up turning into a club. It's not rounded at the bottom, more like an onion. And so the root sheath holds it in place, but over time that bond actually starts to be lost, and then finally the internal root sheath will let go of the hair and allow the hair to actually be lost, and that's what we call telogen effluvium, which is the stage where we actually have shedding, where multiple hairs in telogen are actually lost. It's important to know that, once again, telogen can be as short as weeks and then as long as many years depending on the hair. And so here we can actually see this is anagen right here, and this is actually early anagen. So the hair is actually starting to grow, and it'll actually start to grow and push out a hair that's in telogen. And so it's actually growing up through the follicle after that hair has been shed. Comes out, it's continuing to grow here. All at once, when we get to catagen, what ends up happening is down in here that the papillae starts to actually go away, and it actually pulls back down into the dermis, and so the hair actually starts to separate from it, and then finally here in late catagen, the papillae is all but pretty much gone away from the hair, and it's turned into a club. And then in telogen, you have this club phase, and actually the hair is actually moved slightly up and away from where the bulb is and the papillae is. And then this gives room for the papillae to start making a new hair, and then finally it goes into the telogen effluvium stage where it actually is going to come out. When we look at hair pigment, pigment is from the cortex and the medulla, and it's produced from melanin cells living down at the base of the hair follicle, down in the area around the papillae right there. And so they end up transferring the melanin stained pigments into the cortical and medullary cells. When we look at the melanin that's going to go in there, the color of the hair is going to be depending on the type of melanin that's packed in there. In dogs and horses, it's only one type of melanin, so it totally comes down to how much melanin is actually put in there. If you look at a white or gray hair, there is no melanin within the hair. And then as we start to get to other colors, it ends up being, in horses, how much melanin they put in there, the difference between like brown, black, yellow. In dogs, they have what's known as pheomelanin, which ends up producing a yellow or red hair coat, and then tyrosine melanin, which ends up giving brown and black. One thing to know is that melanin production decreases with age, so hair coat color can change with age, and then certain hairs with age will actually start losing melanocytes that actually produce the color pigmentation, which causes white or gray hairs. Types of hairs, we have primary hairs, which are guard hairs. These are the straight or slightly arched hairs. They're thick, they're long, and much longer than our secondary hairs, and they're the dominant type of hairs in a complex hair follicle. And this is what most mammals have across the surface of their skin. Some dog breeds and in sheep, it ends up being that secondary hairs end up being their main hair. But most of the time, secondary hairs are just that. They're kind of a secondary or a backup hair to the primary hairs. And they're a lot softer. They're generally shorter than what primary hairs are, except in things like poodles and then over in our sheep. The interesting thing with these hairs is that they have a barbed cuticle. And so by having those little barbs on the cuticle, it actually helps to hold the hair together and causes that, like we see with sheep, that wool effect where it's actually all bundles together to make a mat of hair on the outside of the body. The big thing that secondary hairs do, they're also known as wool type hairs or satellite hairs, is they do play an important role in actually conservation of body heat, and then just as importantly, they play a very huge role in actually, especially like in breeds like poodles, as far as actually keeping the skin dry, so they actually can act as a barrier to water. Tactile hairs, these are also known as sinus hairs or whiskers. These are hairs that are used for feeling into the environment. And so like on a cat, their whiskers on their face are tactile hairs. But they actually we actually have tactile hairs across our body just like animals do that are used as kind of feelers. They all don't have to look exactly like a whisker. The erector pili muscle, this muscle is very important. It's going to be smooth muscle. It's going to be very important for doing things such as sitting there and controlling body temperature. So by the way that this hair actually goes either erect or closer to the skin, has a role with how much heat is going to be released from the body or how much heat is let in near the body. It's going to play a role in keeping heat right next to the surface of the skin or keeping cool next to the surface of the skin. And so each hair has actually got or each hair follicle's actually got one of these erector pili muscles to it. It is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, and it also can end up doing things like playing a role in posturing. So an animal that wants to puff up and make itself look bigger, or like when we see like a dog's hackles go up. This is actually a way of actually communicating through the hair. And so if a dog has a certain response and it's trying to protect itself, it will actually sit there and cause the hair on the back of its back to stand up. And it does that with the erector pili muscle. Looking at glands, we have sebaceous glands, so they secrete sebum, which is an oily-like substance. It's important to keep skin and hair pliable and healthy, so it keeps it to where it actually will sit there and bend in the environment. If you don't have enough sebum and you end up getting dry skin, you get flaking of the top of the surface of the skin, and then it makes it to where the hairs are really easy to break. Sweat glands, known as subauriferous glands. We have two different types. We have the eocrine sweat gland, and these actually do not empty into a pore, but actually onto the skin directly. We find them in the paw pads of dogs and cats, and then across the skin of horses and humans. And so this is what actually gives the liquid portion of of profuse sweating, where you end up getting really wet across the surface of the skin. Apocrine sweat glands exit into the pore, and more of their job ends up to be releasing certain salts and waste from the body. They do play a role in cooling, and then also kind of making the sebum a little bit easier to spread out across the surface of the skin. Tail glands, we find these in dogs and cats. They secrete an oily substance that's used as scent, and so a lot of times they can, this is when you see a dog kind of sniffing the backside of the other dog. They're trying to smell that tail gland that has a unique marking scent. And then they also can end up putting smell, like with cats and stuff when they go to the bathroom in a litter box. They can actually use these tail glands to help mark those areas that they've been at. And then on anal sacs, these are actually, or anal glands, these are actually attached to the rectum, right where the anus and the rectum meets. And so whenever, once again, with defecation, there can be scent released onto the feces that can be used for scent marking, but it's also used for defense. So dogs can release these when they get stressed, and it releases a pungent odor that can be used to try to detract any type of attacker. And then the most famous of these using anal sacs for this reason would be the skunk, which uses them as a defense. Sebaceous glands, specifically right here, go on to located into the down into the dermal layers there. They're actually epithelial part of the hair follicle there, but they actually go down into the dermal layers. They can be either simple or complex alveolar, so they're alveolar in shape, and then they can either be a simple or a complex. They're going to produce sebum in most species. In sheep, it's lanolin, and we kind of already discussed where lanolin glands are located at and kind of their role. They're going to actually empty into the hair follicle, and then from there they're going to spread out through the pore up onto the surface of the skin. There are some that actually sit there and empty directly onto the surface, and they're usually like on your lips, so areas that have low amount of hair. You will still have follicles, sebaceous glands there. And so on the lips, the labia of the vulva, around the prepuce of the penis, and on the surface of the penis. Around the anus, eyelids, we have them specifically there, and also inside the ear canal. So sebum is this oily lipid substance manufactured by the sebaceous glands, and it's going to be put out through the gland there, through the duct, out into the pore, and then up onto the skin once again. And the erector pili muscle ends up playing a role in causing this. So usually these glands are right next to the erector pili muscle, and they contract. A certain amount of oil and sebum is going to come to the surface. Some of the things it does is it helps to keep moisture in the skin, keeps the skin from drying out. Once again, the oil also helps to keep the epithelial cells, this cornified, stratified epithelium, from getting dried out, and at the same time that oil also helps to keep it to where it's pliable, to where it's going to move and bend in the environment. And then also plays a role in actually trapping bacteria and keeping it from getting in the body, and so it reduces infection. When we look at our sweat glands, they kind of help cool the body through evaporation. It's one of the things they do. As far as profuse sweat, the type that would actually be used in cooling the body just through sweating on its own, the horse is the only major domesticated species that actually profusely sweats. So once again, the eocrine goes directly on the skin surface, and this is the profuse sweating. This is the one that you do for evaporation across the skin that really sits there and cools the body off. Whereas the apocrine, once again, is in the hair follicle and mixes with the sebum, and just kind of helps that oil move across, and can actually play a role also in evaporation and cooling off the body, but it's not nearly as efficient in doing that as what the eocrine sweat gland is. So it's showing right here where you have an eocrine. These are actually usually a coiled simple tubular that's going to go down in here, and it goes into the dermis. So you have your epidermis and then down into your dermis. This would be your dermal layer here. And so it's coiled and goes down at the bottom, and it comes strictly out on the top of the skin itself. Whereas an apocrine sweat gland, you would have your sebaceous or sebum glands here. They're also somewhat coiled, but when you get down here, they're more of a compound alveolar. And so they're located also down here in the dermal area there, but they end up going right into the pore, and it mixes with the sebum and out onto the surface. Tail gland, they're oval on the base of the tail. So the body's right here, and the rectum's right over here, and they're right underneath this area here. We end up finding that there's a lot of apocrine and sebaceous glands, apocrine sweat glands and sebaceous glands really packed in this area here. We can sometimes find them because there can be an area of thinned hair. It's not totally absent like they're showing this, but it's usually thinned, and there's more of a coarse oily hairs right around it. And so you have a lot of oil and a lot of that comes out in this area, a lot of sebum right here. And so this is once again where we have animals will smell the backside of one another's identification, but it's also some of this will actually get transposed to the environment when they're defecating, and even in cats when they're urinating. So the anal sacs, they're going to be in the line with sebaceous and apocrine sweat glands. They produce a special type of sebum or a musk that ends up being excreted. And so there's always a small amount when they defecate that's going to be on there, on the feces, and it's once again used as a scent marking to end up marking territory between animals. And then like when we get in dogs, they can actually release this when they're frightened or they're stressed. Big thing with dogs is these can become impacted, and then we have to go in there, and that's why we express the anal glands. And if they become impacted for too long, they can actually become infected. And sometimes we have to actually go in there and surgically remove those. So now we move into claws and dew claws. Claws are going to be found in dogs and cats. They're a hard outer covering of the distal digit. They're actually going to be very closely attached and physically attached to the very last bone of the digit, which is known as the third phalanx. They actually, in animals that have claws, they're non-retractable except in cats, and cats are actually able to retract their claws back in. And they end up, main functions they do is actually helping to keep traction in the environment so that they don't, the animal doesn't slip on slick surfaces. And then they can actually assist in things like climbing when we start looking at like cats. And some of our different rodents like squirrels and rats and mice, they really are good for traction for being able to climb on things. And then they're used as a tool for defense and catching prey. Dew claws, on the other hand, end up just being something like a claw, but they end up being an outer covering of remnants of digits that, like in a dog on the very first digit, in cats, on the front legs, they have the dew claw on the inside, kind of like our thumb, and so it's just a covering there. They don't really walk on it. There can be some uses for it, but it's not a grasping digit like our thumb is. And then we call dew claws the hind digits on our are farm livestock like cows, pigs, and sheep. And so these are actually vestiges of the second and fifth digits that come off the back of the leg. And they don't actually walk on them anymore. At one time they were four-toed on the ground, but now they're only two. And so the dew claws, we call them dew claws, they're actually little remnants of hooves that are left there, but we call them a dew claw, and they're at the back of the foot, and they're attached with the second and fifth digits. Hoof, on the other hand, is what's going to hit the ground and be what they walk on in those same farm animals, along with the horse. So we call them ungulates, the animals that end up having hooves. So you have the horses, cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, that would all be in that area. When we start looking at the hoof, the hoof is going to end up going over the entire digit. When we look at things like the dew claws, like if this was a cow, you'd have a dew claw back here. They're not necessarily weight bearing. But the hoof surface right here does end up bearing weight, but it doesn't bear it across the whole foot, and that's what they kind of mean here with not all hooves are weight bearing. They do bear weight, the ones that contact the ground, but really not all surfaces are. And so we'll see that in a second here when we go further in the slides. The very inner layer is modified dermis. It is known as sensitive lamina, and the outer layer is modified epithelial layer, and there's actually no feeling to it, so we call that the insensitive laminae. And so when we look inside the foot, and this is kind of a diagram showing the different parts of it right here, we have the corium. And so when we look at the corium right here, we have the sensitive tissue underneath it, and this sensitive tissue is well innervated and can feel pain. And so we call that laminar corium, which is the sensitive part of the corium, or the sensitive laminae. And then we have the different layers of the insensitive, or the outer, starting at the periopal corium, and so this ends up being the very outside of the hoof or the claw, and this ends up being kind of a very thin layer of epithelial cells that's main job is to help keep in moisture into the foot and keep excess moisture from entering, but also keeping it from drying out and too much moisture from leaving. We have what's known as coronary corium, and this is actually where it grows from. The hoof will grow down, or even the nail bed has this too, where it's actually growing down from where the hair and the skin meet, and it grows down the hoof or the nail from there. We have what's known as sole corium. So this is the part in horses and cattle and sheep and pigs where they actually walk on, or is contacting the ground, not really walking on it, but they're actually contacting the ground, and that's known as sole corium. And then the horse has this unique structure called the frog, and they actually have what's known as frog corium. So this right here is actually showing the bones coming down. So we have the metacarpal bone. This is the fetlock right here with proximal P1, proximal phalanx, middle phalanx. Here's our distal phalanx, or the coffin bone. And then down here would actually be all the hoof attached to it right there. And so the foot in ungulates is actually going to be, the whole hoof is coming around and actually surrounding and attaching to this distal phalanx, or this coffin bone right there. The laminae in there between the insensitive lamina, which is the outer part of the foot, and the sensitive lamina, which is the dermal on the inside, is actually a very unique and way that it has to actually interdigitate to actually help hold that hoof onto the bone and keep that hoof from easily coming off and being damaged off of the foot. When we look at the bottom of the foot, we have what's known as the hoof wall, and this is the part where it's actually bearing weight. The sole is this portion of the foot, and it actually does not bear weight. When we look at the foot in the horse, the very back part of the foot is known as the heels. So this is the heels back here on the back. The very front is known as the toe, and between the heel and the toe ends up being the quarter. This is the sole right here, where the hoof wall and the sole meets is a little area that's white, and we call it the white line. Where the hoof wall comes back around and bends back in here on the foot and meets with the sole, this area is known as the bars. This is the frog, this little triangular straight structure. This is important in horses. Up underneath it ends up being the digital cushion. So part of the job of the frog is it's attached to the digital cushion, and so it's somewhat of a cushioning aspect to the foot when it comes down. And it actually sits down lower than the sole and takes some of the force. The other thing is there's actually a venous plexus hooked underneath the frog, so when a horse puts pressure on the frog, it actually causes blood flow to travel back up the leg and towards the heart. On either side of the frog is a groove that runs in there between the bars and the frog, and we know that as the sulcus. Lastly, we get the horns, and so horns are made of the same thing as hooves. It's just you have a corium, you have a sensitive layer in here, and then you have a stratified corneum, or what's known as cornified horn cells. It's coming out, and the main thing to know about a horn is that it's just like a hoof or a nail or a claw. It's going to sit there and grow throughout the life of the animal. It is attached to bone underneath, and there's actually bone that will actually grow into the horn. Specific things to know between horns and antlers. Horns are not specific to sex, so both males and females have them. They're epidermal in origin. They end up growing continuously. And in the center of all horns is a bone that's going to be hollow and communicates directly in the frontal sinuses. We have bred certain animals to be what we call polled breeds, and they don't grow horns anymore. So in our cattle, we have our polled breeds. Like our Angus is a polled breed that's been bred not to grow horns when we look in cattle. Antlers, on the other hand, is primarily only found in males. It has a dermal origin. They're actually shed annually. They do have a bony protuberance at the skull where the dermal attachment's at, but the bone does not actually grow into the antler. So it actually has a lack of a central core and a lack of actually a internal blood supply. So actually what you have is velvet skin on the outside, and that velvet skin actually has all of the blood vessels and nerves growing on the outside to the inside, and there's no actual true bone attachment here, and they actually shed off every year and grow new ones.